You're listening to Blue, a story from the Zulu Universe, written by Sam Renner, narrated by the voices at 11labs.io. Part 4. 2 days into a week-long flight, and Raymond felt like he owed Crazy Eyes an apology. First, for calling him Crazy Eyes. He had a name. It was Brian. He was a good pilot, ran a straight ship, flew it smooth, and he could hold a conversation, never a guarantee on one of these shuttles. He should be flying with a crew of 2, he said, but his regular co-pilot started having gut troubles a few weeks back, and he dropped her at one of the big civilian ships so she could get treated and some time to recover. He'd been flying solo since, and had started to go a little crazy out here in the dark all by himself. Raymond knew what it was like to get sick out here without ready access to medical help, and gut troubles were the worst. But this woman's loss was his gain. Her absence left a free bed, and that, more than anything, may have been what made this trip more pleasurable than any other time he'd been on a shuttle. "You hungry?" Brian shouted down the corridor from the small shuttle's smaller galley. Raymond had been sitting on the woman's bed with 2 vials of Maudie spread out in front of him. He'd been debating whether it'd be an island night and he'd down a shot of Yucatan, or if he'd take a little trip to somewhere unknown and down one of the new bottles the girl back on Zulu had sold him. He stood and snatched both vials from the mattress and dropped them in his pocket. "I could eat," he said as he rounded the corner from the hallway into the galley. Brian was already sitting on one side of the booth on the wall across from the doorway. He had a bowl of reconstituted something in front of him. A second bowl sat in front of the seat across. Raymond slipped into that side of the booth and grabbed the spoon already sunk into the bowl. Noodles. He took a bite. The broth was beefy. It wasn't bad for shuttle food. He slurped a second bite, then asked Brian what he knew about EHR 618. "This rock? Not much. Not too big, not too small. Productive, from what I hear. They are getting a lot out of it." "But why am I going?" Raymond asked. "Oh, I don't know that. I'm just given a name and a destination. They don't tell me anything about who's flying, where, or why." Raymond wiped a bit of broth from his chin with the backside of his sleeve. "I don't want to hear what they are saying. I want to know what you're hearing. You pilots talk. I know you're not the only one flying into that asteroid. What's the chatter?" Brian brought a spoonful of noodles to his mouth. He chewed and swallowed, then picked up the bowl and started to drink the rest of the broth. Raymond. "Oh, come on." Brian put the bowl back down on the table and leaned back in the booth. "I don't know, man. You're one of them." "Them?" Raymond grabbed his mostly finished bowl of noodles from the table and stood. He picked up Brian's empty bowl and took them both over to the sink. "You know what I mean?" Brian said. "You're part of them. You're part of corporate. You may be a nice guy, and you are so far, but you're still corporate security. End of the day, your interests may not line up with mine." Raymond sat back down, his legs up on the seat and his back to the wall. "What interests do I have that you don't have? I want this company to be as profitable as it can be. That should interest all of us, no matter where in the organization we are." Raymond heard it as it was coming out of his mouth. There may not have been anything he could have said that made him sound more like a corporate lackey than that. Brian didn't respond. "Okay," Raymond admitted. "I know how that sounds. I'm just saying that I'm a low-level employee like you." "Pardon me?" "Damn, okay, here's what I mean. I'm nobody. I'm a security guy. There are hundreds of us, maybe more than 1,000. I don't know, I've never counted, but I'm not some higher-up. I'm just a guy, like you and like the people who work the mines out on those rocks. It only happens that this is my job. I'm not looking to go rat anyone out. I'm not looking to turn anyone one in for anything. I'm not out here to make a bunch of arrests. I'm an investigator. They send me places for a reason. I just want to know what I'm getting myself into." "Who's your boss?" "I know. Ask him. And he's briefed me." Brian cut Raymond off. "No, that's not what I'm asking. Where does he sit? Where's his office?" "Headquarters." "Exactly!" Brian nearly shouted it, a satisfied half-smile on his face. Raymond just stared, still hoping for more of a clue to the point he was trying to make. Brian tried to explain. "My boss is a guy flying a ship a little bigger than this one. He answers to a guy whose office is on one of those civvy ships. That guy, his boss, is a couple doors down. There's 4 layers above me before I get to someone who's at HQ. The guys out on that rock we'll hit in a couple of days probably don't even know there's some HQ where someone is tracking their productivity. They've only met recruiters or ship captains like me. So when you say you're just like us, you aren't. Raymond leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. You think I'm some guy with close ties to the Blue Star executive team? You think that just because the guy I answer to works back home somehow gives me privilege? Want to know how many times I've met the guy in almost 20 years doing this job? Twice? 2 times? First time I happened to be in the same place he was during some kind of glad-handing tour of the civvy ships. Second time? Raymond trailed off. His mind drifted back to the time he was on the wrong side of an interrogation table being asked questions about what happened at a mining camp after he left. Why had so many more miners ended up dead after he'd investigated and declared the place safe? Why had Blue Star been forced to shut down operations for more than a week to get the Rock's staff back up to the levels it needed to run at full efficiency? Raymond didn't have answers to those questions. He didn't have answers to any questions. It was that lack of answers that landed him out here, running checks for missing equipment of some far-off mines. It's what had created his Modi habit. Because he should have found something. He should have seen whatever it was there was to see. Because he hadn't miners died. Because he hadn't seen anything wrong. People didn't get to go home. And he wasn't okay with that. And the second time? Brian's question snatches Raymond out of his own memory and sits him back at the table across from his new pilot. Second time was, well, I've met the guy twice. So don't think that just because my chain of command is a little shorter than yours means we are in any way different. Nice speech, but, man, I don't know. Raymond reached into his pocket and felt the vials of Modi. He rolled one of them between his fingers, then pulled them out and set them on the table. They clinked together, then fell over. One rolled across and stopped itself in front of Brian. It was the vial of Yucatan, and Raymond thought long and hard before he offered what he offered next. Tell you what. He hesitated again. Tell me something, anything, about the camp I'm headed to, and that bottle is yours tonight. Brian picked it up and spun off the top. He brought the open container to his nose and breathed in deep. Raymond can smell it too, the pineapple and coconut, followed by a little bite of bitter. He's already regretting his decision, but before he can take it back, Brian has downed the vial. He slid down in his seat and started talking. Missing equipment at the mines. He stammered and stuttered through a few more words, but it all became quickly incoherent. A whole vial like that got a trip started quickly, even with an experienced traveler like Brian. Raymond picked up the empty vial of Yucatan off the table. He ran a finger across the opening, hoping to get whatever might have been left behind. He put the finger in his mouth and felt the burn of Modi on his tongue. He held the bottle to the light. It was empty. He pulled his own vial off the table and looked at the label. It was something the girl gave him. He opened the top, and the first thing he smelled was licorice. His shoulders slumped. The girl had used him. Gave him the stuff that doesn't sell. Just like the candy, no one wanted this stuff. He downed it anyway, wincing and chasing it with what was left of his coffee. He slumped back in his seat and waited to go on whatever kind of trip you got with licorice-flavored Modi. Both Brian and Raymond woke the next morning in the galley. Raymond was up first and found Brian laying across the hard tile floor. Raymond poked him with a foot, and Brian blinked his eyes open. He smiled. "My God, man," he said. "Never had Yucatan before?" Brian pushed himself up on one arm. "No," he said, "but I'm going to make sure I do again." He stood on wobbly legs, then dismissed himself. "I have a ship to fly." He stumbled out of the galley, catching himself on the door jamb as he exited the room. Raymond stood. His mind was still on the second time he met his boss, and what happened on that mine. The vial of licorice swill he downed last night did nothing to dull the thoughts that had been jumping and screaming for his attention. They were still there, still looking for space in his head, and without anything else to think about, he let them in. First, they came slowly, one at a time. What did you miss? Who didn't you talk to? Next, they came in pairs. Knowing what you know now, how did those miners really die? And was whatever killed them human? Then they stopped coming in any kind of orderly fashion. It was a mental bum rush that overwhelmed and crippled Raymond's mental capabilities. When he got like this, he couldn't do anything else. His mind wouldn't let him. It was all he could do to stand and get back to his borrowed bed and back into his stash of Modi. He found his way to his feet. He found his way to his room. His hand found its way into the pocket inside his bag, and his fingers found their way around another vial of Modi. He pulled it out and spun off the top. He was hit by the smell of the Caribbean, Yucatan. He brought the vial to his lips and began to tip his head back. Then he stopped. Something grew in him, something steel. He felt it in his lower back, and it sat him up straighter as it rose through his chest. It was determination and resolve. He put the vial down and secured the top. He dropped it back into the pocket and instead grabbed his data pad off the side table next to him. He opened it and found the application that Blue Star offered him in place of a therapist, because what kind of person working where he worked could find a therapist? It's not like they had offices on transfer stations or fueling ships, but this app worked. A few minutes reading the words there helped him to remember that his identity wasn't wrapped up in this one huge mistake. Brian found Raymond later on his borrowed bed. Raymond had spent most of the day there watching downloaded videos on his datapad and researching what he could about EHR 618. Good-sized asteroid, but not the biggest. Productive mine for many years, although that had fallen off some in the last few. Older crew worked there, run by an experienced chief, so things were efficient. Blue Star had plans to retire the mine sometime in the near future. There was no date set yet, but they had been shutting down those veins that turned unproductive. "How you doing?" Brian asked as he appeared in the doorway. "Good. But it looked like last night's trip was rough on you." "In all the best ways." Brian reached into a pocket on the front of his flight suit and pulled out 2 vials of Maori. He held them out so Raymond could see them. The labels were written in some language he didn't understand. "Small batch, handcrafted. One more trip tonight before I have to drop you off?" Raymond considered it. He's better now. This trip would be just for fun, and he'd never had small batch before. He'd heard about it, but no one he bought from ever had any. "Yeah, sounds good. See you in the galley." Brian paused to check the time on his datapad. "About an hour?" The food that night was some kind of potato dish. Brian pulled it out of the little heating unit in the wall. Steam rose from the top. Brian slid the casserole dish on the table. "Something I like to make on the last night of a flight with someone. Sort of a thanks for flying with Brian thing." Raymond grabbed a fork and dug in, happy to not eat noodles for a 6th night. He pulled a scoopful from the dish and cheese from inside strung out in long ropes. He smelled bacon. "What is this?" "Real food," Brian says. "Or realish. The potatoes are instant. The rest of it is all real food that's shelf-stable, or stable enough if you eat it quickly. I pick it up whenever I stop at the civvy ships. Treat myself with it when I'm feeling lonely. Or I'm shipping someone around who I like. If you stay in whatever bunk I'm able to give you and don't interact with the rest of the ship, then you're on your own. But you've been a good passenger." Raymond takes another bite. Bacon. My God, I'd forgotten about bacon. Blue is a production of SciFiSerials.com and 6-to-1 Books and Media. Want to keep up with when new episodes are released? Visit the site, sign up for the newsletter, join the adventure.